Parasite Eve and Final Fantasy VII are some of my favorite Square games, and they actually share some really interesting development crossovers. When Final Fantasy VII was originally going to be developed for the SNES, it was going to take place in New York City, featuring the main character of a hot-headed Detective Joe, which is hilarious, chasing after a group of eco-terrorists that have been responsible for a bunch of events in New York City. Man, it's crazy to think what we could have gotten there, and Parasite Eve actually got a bunch of development ideas that crossed over from the destroyed version or original prototype version of Final Fantasy VII before it became set in Gaia and in New York City was changed over to Midgar. But these are some fascinating ways that Final Fantasy and Parasite Eve share some of the most famous cases of creative recycling to ever happen in gaming. The relationship between Final Fantasy VII and Parasite Eve is one of the most famous cases of creative recycling in gaming history. In 1994, when Final Fantasy VI wrapped up, series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi began planning Final Fantasy VII. Before it became the sci-fi, planet-saving epic we know today, the earliest prototype and script treatments looked radically different, and many of those discarded concepts directly birthed Parasite Eve. The DNA of that Final Fantasy VII prototype shaped Parasite Eve in several major ways. In Sakaguchi's original 1994 pitch, Final Fantasy VII wasn't set on the fictional planet Gaia. It was set on Earth, specifically in a gritty, modern version of New York City set in 1999. When the Final Fantasy VII team pivoted towards a more high fantasy diesel punk aesthetic, Sakaguchi couldn't shake the idea of a modern New York setting. Shortly after, Square acquired the rights to adapt Hideki Sena's Japanese horror novel Parasite Eve. Sakaguchi took his scrapped NYC setting and used it as the canvas for the game, transforming locations like Manhattan, Central Park, and Carnegie Hall into a bio-horror playground. The narrative framework of the early Final Fantasy VII script was a detective mystery. The original protagonist was a hot-headed NYPD cop named Detective Joe. His mission was to track down a rogue eco-terrorist group that was plotting to blow up the city's power grid. That prototype eventually evolved into Avalanche, and a berserker character on their squad with a sealed left arm became Cloud Strife. But the core concept of a gritty New York City police officer investigating a catastrophic citywide threat was completely transplanted into Parasite Eve, with rookie cop Aya Brea replacing Detective Joe. Sakaguchi chose life as the central theme for the next Final Fantasy to cope with the passing of his mother. In the early NYC script, this manifested as a spiritual force tied to the city. When FF7 shifted to Gaia, this became the life stream and Mako energy. In Parasite Eve, that exact same thematic fascination with the biological and spiritual essence of life was adapted through a sci-fi horror lens. Instead of the life stream, the narrative focused on rebellious, sentient mitochondria trying to birth the ultimate being. During the mid-90s, Square was incredibly experimental. The engine and cinematic style developed for Final Fantasy VII heavily influenced Parasite Eve, which was frequently described by critics at the same time as a hybrid of Final Fantasy VII and Resident Evil. Parasite Eve utilized a heavy modified version of Final Fantasy's classic active time battle system. Just like in Final Fantasy VII, you had to wait for a gauge to fill before taking an action. However, Parasite Eve added a real-time grid that allowed Aya to physically run around and dodge attacks while waiting on her turn, a mechanic that felt like a bridge between traditional turn-based JRPGs and survival horror. Aya's parasite energy also functioned exactly like magic, offering stat boosts, heals, and offensive bursts. The Final Fantasy VII prototype was incredibly fertile ground for other games too. A sorceress character cut from the New York City script was saved and later became Ada in Final Fantasy VIII. Meanwhile, another pitch for Final Fantasy VII by Tetsuya Takahashi was deemed too dark and complicated for a mainline Final Fantasy game, so Square gave him his own budget to make a standalone title, Xenogears.